Wisconsin made a bet most of America wouldn't take, that staying small, local, and stubbornly unchanged could beat strip malls and corporate chains. 15 towns across the state froze somewhere between 1950 and 1970, preserving not just buildings, but entire ways of life. Supper clubs serving brandy, old fashions, and Friday fish fries. Main streets with zero chains. Lake cabins where grandkids sleep in the same knotty pine bedrooms their grandparents did. From a Swiss village that rebuilt itself as a 1960s fantasy of the Alps to a Mississippi River hamlet of 66 people surviving on art and pie, these communities prove the most radical thing a town can do is refuse to change. While the rest of the country modernized, Wisconsin's most authentic corners just kept serving the same whitefish, the same cheese curds, and the same small-town character that made the Midwest America's heartland in the first place. New Glarus didn't just preserve its past. It constructed a very specific version of it in the 1960s, rebuilding downtown as an idealized Swiss alpine village with chalets, flower boxes, and painted facades that represent mid-century America's fantasy of Switzerland more than actual Switzerland. Founded by Swiss immigrants in 1845, the town made a calculated decision during the era when other communities were modernizing, double down on ethnic heritage as a tourism strategy. The Swiss Historical Village Museum preserves genuine immigrant life with 14 original log buildings from the settlement era. But downtown is something else entirely. A living snapshot of 1960s heritage tourism before multiculturalism existed, when small towns could build their entire identity around a single ethnicity, and visitors would drive hours to experience it. New Glarus Brewing Company, founded in 1993, fits seamlessly into this aesthetic. Their Spotted Cow beer, sold only in Wisconsin, has become pilgrimage-worthy, and the brewery operates with the small-town, handcrafted ethos that defines the place. Walking Main Street means encountering Roof's Meat Market, a butcher shop operating since 1949, and the New Glarus Hotel Restaurant, serving Swiss fondue and schnitzel in an 1853 building where the menu hasn't betrayed its origins. The Wilhelm Tell Festival, performed since 1938 and in German until the 1990s, proves this isn't performance for tourists. It's lived culture that just happens to also attract visitors. New Glarus succeeded by creating something genuinely unique. A town that froze not in the 1950s exactly, but in the 1950s idea of ethnic preservation, and never wavered from that vision. Mineral Point froze twice. First, when lead mining collapsed in the 1860s, abandoning Cornish limestone cottages built by English immigrants in the 1830s to 1840s. Then again, when Highway 151 bypassed it, and artists moved into those same crumbling stone buildings in the 1950s to 60s. The Pendarvis Historic Site preserves a row of 1840s Cornish workers' cottages that nearly faced demolition in the 1930s until early preservationists recognized their value, decades before historic preservation became mainstream. Downtown's High Street features commercial buildings from the 1840s to 1860s, operating as galleries, studios, and shops. The entire district listed on the National Register because virtually nothing was torn down or significantly altered. What makes Mineral Point remarkable is how artist migration in the mid-20th century saved the architecture by giving it purpose. Cheap rent in historic buildings attracted potters, painters, and craftspeople who needed studio space and didn't care about modern amenities. Foundry Books operates in an 1867 building. Redberry Pottery has thrown pots since 1979, and multiple galleries occupy storefronts that would have collapsed without tenant income. The Mineral Point Historic Theater, built in 1914 and restored in 1983, still shows movies on weekends with the same small-town movie-going experience. Velvet curtains, creaking seats, popcorn from a cart. Red Rooster Cafe serves comfort food in an 1840s building where stone walls 2 feet thick keep the dining room cool even in August. This is double-time capsule preservation. Walking these streets means experiencing both 1840s Cornish mining architecture and the 1950s to 60s Bohemian artist colony culture that saved it, neither one erased by what came after. Stockholm exists because it's too small to bother with. 66 residents can't support a gas station, much less attract Walmart's site selection team. And that microscopic population saved 3 blocks of 1850s buildings perched on bluffs above the Mississippi River. Founded by Swedish immigrants in 1851, the village maintained its original settlement layout simply because no growth ever required changing it. Spring Street runs 3 blocks with a handful of businesses. Stockholm General Store operating since the 1800s. Stockholm Pie Company, baking fruit pies that draw fans from the Twin Cities 2 hours away. A to Z Produce, selling Amish goods, 1 furniture store. The entire annual economy runs on a single weekend in July when Stockholm Art Fair transforms the village. 45 artists, 5,000 visitors, and sales funding the next 51 weekends of quiet existence. This feast or famine model lets Stockholm avoid year-round commercialization. You can't justify modernizing for 1 busy weekend. Great River Road, scenic traffic provides steady trickle income, but nothing requiring infrastructure beyond what 1950s already built. Stockholm Village Park overlooks the river with the same band shell, same benches, same view generations of families have photographed. The Swedish heritage here isn't commercialized like New Gläros. It's lived quietly through Lutheran church services, Scandinavian surnames on mailboxes, and stubborn insistence that 66 people constitutes viable community. Stockholm proves the smallest towns preserve best because corporations need population density to justify investment. And when you stay microscopically small, authenticity survives by corporate neglect. Bayfield froze at the end of Highway 13, where Wisconsin's northern coast runs out of land. A Victorian lumber port turned Lake Superior fishing village turned gateway to Apostle Islands, each era visible in buildings that never faced demolition because geographic isolation made modernization impractical. Downtown's Victorian commercial blocks feature original storefronts operating businesses from the 1950s or earlier. Grönke's restaurant, serving whitefish livers since the 1950s in recipes unchanged from opening day. Big Water Coffee Roasters in a brick building older than the state. Magnum's pouring drinks since 1971. The Old Rittenhouse Inn, a Queen Anne mansion turned bed and breakfast, maintains Victorian interiors because guests specifically seek that unchanged character. Modernization would destroy the asset. Bayfield's waterfront still functions as working harbor where commercial fishing boats dock beside tour vessels heading to the Apostle Islands, preserving the mixed-use character of 1950s waterfronts before recreational boating pushed out industry. The 1882 ship canal, the working docks, the fish cleaning stations represent living maritime infrastructure connecting present directly to past through continuous operation. Bayfield Apple Festival, running since 1962, celebrates genuine orchard heritage. These hillsides produced commercial apples through the 1950s, and festival attendance proves harvest traditions authentic enough to draw crowds annually. Winter brings ice caves forming in Apostle Island's sea caves. Summer brings sailing regattas, and the seasonal rhythm hasn't changed since the 1960s established this tourism calendar. Lake Superior's isolation preserved Bayfield by making bypass impossible and luxury development impractical. You're at the end of the road, facing the largest freshwater lake on Earth, and that geographic finality froze the Victorian port character perfectly. Fish Creek maintained 1950s family vacation culture by making conscious choice, reject luxury development, refuse chain stores, keep everything exactly as Milwaukee grandparents remember from childhood summers. Peninsula Players Theatre has performed in the same garden setting since 1935, and that continuity defines the town. Theatre audiences return for decades, developing loyalty not just to plays, but to the unchanged village surrounding them. Downtown businesses occupy 1890s to 1940s, buildings operating family enterprises, Casablanca Candies since 1968, Door County Mercantile, Pastimes Antiques filling Victorian storefronts, White Gull Inn serves traditional Door County fish boil in outdoor cauldrons, whitefish and potatoes boiled exactly as done since the 1960s, when the inn popularized this Scandinavian cooking method for tourists. Peninsula State Park, adjacent to town, preserved surrounding landscape from development. The 1909 Parks Golf Course, bike trails, and Eagle Bluff Lighthouse operate with minimal updates since 1950s. Families played the same 9 holes and climbed the same tower. Summer cottages like Kurt's maintain modest 1950s cabin aesthetic rather than upgrading to luxury. Knotty pine interiors, simple furnishings, lakefront porches where 3 generations gather. This democratic vacation tradition created powerful economic incentive. Families return because it's unchanged, so changing it would destroy the business model. Sister Bay kept working-class soul, while Door County around it went upscale. Commercial fishing boats still dock at the marina beside pleasure craft. Sister Bay Bowl operates with 1957 vintage equipment and attached bar serving league nights, and Al Johnson's Swedish restaurant has grazed live goats on its grass roof since 1949 in pure roadside attraction glory. Husby's Food and Spirits epitomizes supper club tradition unchanged. Brandy, old fashions, Friday fish fry, prime rib on weekends, relish tray appearing automatically. The waterfront hosts free Wednesday concerts with portable stage and bleachers exactly as done since the 1960s. No permanent amphitheater, no corporate sponsorship, just community gathering. Norwegian Independence Day on May 17th gets celebrated seriously here. Heritage visible in Lutheran Church, and surnames but not theme-parked into costume. What distinguishes Sister Bay is authenticity of working town function. The bowling alley, the fishing docks, the supper clubs serve year-round residents, not summer tourists. This creates genuine 1950s small-town character. Places exist because locals need them, and tourists experience real community infrastructure rather than heritage performance constructed for their benefit. Ephraim stayed frozen through religious conviction. Moravian founders in 1853 banned alcohol, and that prohibition lasted 163 years until 2016, preventing the bar culture and nightlife development that transformed other resort towns into unrecognizable versions of themselves. White buildings with green trim dominate downtown in traditional Scandinavian colors, creating visual unity enforced by community pressure rather than ordinance. The Moravian Church, built in 1857, remains active congregation, and that religious heritage shaped preservation ethic, valuing simplicity and stewardship over commerce. Anderson Store operates since 1858 as hybrid general store and museum, selling penny candy alongside displays of 19th century goods. Ephraim Resorts never upgraded to luxury. Eagle Harbor Inn and Ephraim Shores maintain modest 1950s motel rooms with minimal amenities because guests return specifically for lakefront simplicity their grandparents experienced. Wilson's Restaurant serves plain American food in a 1940s building with menu unchanged because fancy would violate the wholesome family-focused character. Even after the 2016 alcohol ban lifted, ingrained culture prevented bars from opening. Decades of temperance created identity impossible to erase with law change. The Firball Festival bonfire celebrates Norwegian heritage through participation rather than performance. And that lived culture distinguishes Ephraim from commercialized ethnic tourism. Sturgeon Bay maintained blue-collar shipbuilding identity while Door County transformed into resort destination. Palmer Johnson Yachts and successor Fincantieri Bay Shipbuilding represent over a century of maritime industry defining the city's working waterfront. 3rd Avenue downtown features supper clubs serving actual shipyard workers. Donnie's Glidden Lodge, operating since 1910. Nightingale Supper Club from the 1950s, pouring brandy old fashions for morning shift workers, not tourists chasing nostalgia. The 1882 ship canal still operates with lift bridge rising for commercial vessels, and Door County Maritime Museum preserves this heritage through working tugboat and active docks connecting past directly to present. Local diners open early for shipyard shifts. Bluefront Cafe, Sonny's Pizzeria since the 1960s, serving the practical food culture of manufacturing towns. What preservation means here differs fundamentally from resort towns to the north. Sturgeon Bay froze as working city, where businesses serve residents' daily needs rather than tourist curiosity, maintaining functional downtown with hardware stores and pharmacies alongside taverns. Miller Art Museum and Door County Historical Museum provide cultural infrastructure reflecting 1950s ideal of small cities with engaged citizens supporting arts without pretension. Tomahawk transitioned from logging extraction to up-north recreation in the 1950s, when highways made the Northwoods accessible to Milwaukee and Chicago families, then simply stopped evolving. The knotty pine cabin aesthetic, the modest lakefront resorts, the democratic vacation culture where pontoon boats matter more than yacht clubs, all froze at that moment and never modernized. Downtown brick buildings from the 1870s to 1880s, lumber boom house businesses serving cabin owners, Harley-Davidson dealer in historic storefront, Sarah's Family Restaurant operating classic diner model, Pine River Supper Club, maintaining Friday fish fry and old-fashioned traditions without alteration, Hiawatha Trail System follows former railroad beds for biking and snowmobiling, preserving 1960s recreation infrastructure when Wisconsin pioneered recreational snowmobile culture that operates today with same trail networks and club traditions. The Up North mythology, Tomahawk, embodies crystallized mid-century, working-class families returning to same simple cabins generationally, fishing from docks their grandparents built, eating shore lunch of fried walleye exactly as always done. This wasn't elite recreation requiring luxury. It was democratic access to lakes and forests, and that accessibility defined the culture. Resorts surrounding town maintain 1950s simplicity because upgrading would violate the up-north authenticity families seek. Small rooms, shared bathrooms, communal fish cleaning houses, nothing fancy because fancy misses the point entirely. Clinton made turtle racing its preservation strategy. Since 1945, championship turtles have raced down Main Street in the most perfectly mid-century small-town promotional stunt imaginable, and that quirky tradition gave the town identity worth protecting when other 2,000-person communities faded into generic sameness. The annual festival draws thousands to watch reptiles plod toward finish lines, celebrating wholesome Americana roadside oddity culture that interstates nearly killed, but Clinton kept alive. That tradition meant preserving the backdrop, 1890s canal front commercial buildings on Milwaukee Street forming cohesive historic district, Wally's Dry Goods, operating since 1895, Clinton House Tavern, locally owned pharmacy and hardware store, serving daily needs rather than nostalgia tourism. The Beloit-Rockford Canal shaped downtown layout in the 1890s, and though no longer functional, canal-era architecture maintains distinct identity different from railroad or highway towns. Surrounding dairy farms provided stable customer base through mid-century, preventing the boom-bust cycles that lead to abandonment. Agricultural economy steadiness meant buildings stayed occupied and maintained without crisis. Clinton Historical Museum preserves both canal heritage and turtle racing history, recognizing the quirky festival as legitimate cultural tradition connecting present to mid-century moment, when small towns invented oddball attractions to distinguish themselves and put communities on maps. Tourists actually consulted. Lake Mills guards Aztalan State Park's 900-year-old platform mounds and reconstructed stockade walls, ancient Native American settlement, creating preservation ethic that extended forward through centuries to protect 1890s to 1940s downtown and mid-century small-town rhythms still defining the community. Living beside archaeological sites fostered respect for deep history, and that mindset valued pioneer buildings and recent heritage too. If earthworks from AD 1000 matter, Victorian commercial blocks matter, dairy heritage matters, Main Street continuity matters. Downtown businesses serve agricultural hinterland in buildings largely unchanged. Main Street Cafe operating classic diner model, Lake Mills House Tavern, locally owned shops, avoiding chains because town stayed small enough, 5,800, that local ownership remained viable. Positioned between Madison and Milwaukee but never suburbanized, Lake Mills remained trade center for surrounding dairy farms rather than transforming into bedroom community, and that functional purpose preserved authentic character. The Aztalan Museum, operated by Historical Society, presents layered time without hierarchy. Prehistoric settlement, pioneer history, cheese factory heritage all treated as continuum rather than separate eras. This deep-time perspective distinguishes Lake Mills. Preservation isn't nostalgia for one golden moment, but recognition that respecting what came before creates identity worth maintaining. Plain demonstrates how agricultural communities preserve through continuous practice rather than conscious heritage movement. Amish families who arrived in the 1970s rejecting modernity reinforced existing residents' preference for 1950s small-town simplicity, two preservation ethics supporting each other without coordination. Amish buggies pass Plain Pantry Bakery, selling traditional baked goods, general store, tavern, post office, serving population of 800 with minimal commercial infrastructure because neither Amish nor non-Amish residents wanted corporate development. The driftless area's distinctive topography, steep bluffs, spring-fed valleys, unflattened by glaciers, was never industrialized or intensively developed, preserving scenic landscape matching every idealized postcard of rural Wisconsin. Red barns on hillsides, winding roads, cattle grazing pastures unchanged since the 1950s, when this agricultural character defined regional identity. Plain Cheese Factory operated for decades using small-scale production methods, serving local dairy farms. And though recently closed, cheese heritage shapes community memory, and surrounding producers continue traditions. Extreme simplicity here contrasts with nearby Spring Green's Frank Lloyd Wright sophistication, highlighting Plain's undesigned authenticity. Nothing curated or planned, just persistence of traditional farming life, because modernization never arrived, and Amish presence ensured it won't. Nelson survived by staying microscopic. 300 residents for over a century means no corporation ever bothered developing it, and that neglect saved 1870s buildings built into Mississippi River bluffs until 1970s artists discovered cheap rent and scenic isolation worth more than modernization. The cheese factory, built in 1856, operated until 2007, then became art center rather than demolition site, because potters and painters needed gallery space, and historic industrial buildings provided it without requiring new construction. Multiple galleries occupy Victorian storefronts, Jacobson Pottery, the Stone Barn, spaces where artists work and sell without separating studio from sales floor. Great River Road traffic provides steady trickle tourism. Scenic drivers stop for galleries and river views, but nothing requiring modern infrastructure beyond what 1950s already built. Dickeyville preserved itself through folk art. Father Matthias Wernerus spent 1925-1930 covering church grounds with mosaics, shrines, and sculptures made from glass, shells, and porcelain, creating the ultimate roadside attraction from the era when religious devotion and patriotic kitsch coexisted without irony. The grotto became 1950s tourist draw, bringing just enough visitors to sustain the tiny Mississippi River town without boom transforming it, while lead zinc mining collapse left downtown economically frozen. Holy Ghost Church still uses the grotto for devotions, functional religious site rather than pure tourist attraction, and that dual purpose keeps it living heritage instead of museum exhibit. Cedarburg's 5-story 1864 woolen mill still anchors downtown. Cream brick, massive timber beams, industrial windows, now housing wineries and shops, but never demolished because the building was simply too substantial to erase. Over 120 structures earned National Register status, making this Wisconsin's most complete 19th-century commercial district, where Schroeder's department store has operated since 1956, and Friday fish fries have never missed a week in living memory. The mill's adaptive reuse in the 1970s created a preservation template. Save industrial architecture through commerce rather than turning it into museums. Let businesses occupy historic space and generate revenue that funds maintenance. Columbia St. Mary's Hospital nearby provided economic stability, preventing the decline that leads to demolition. Steady jobs meant downtown stayed functional rather than becoming nostalgic performance space. Festival economy pioneered here in the 1960s to 70s brought 100,000 visitors to Strawberry Festival annually, proving heritage tourism could sustain towns without requiring chain stores or modern development, and that model froze Cedarburg exactly where prosperity and preservation intersected.